The moment a police officer says, "I'm going to call for a K9 unit," time starts to feel different. Your heart rate shifts. Minutes feel longer. The roadside suddenly feels smaller. Cars are flying past, but everything around you feels suspended in slow motion. And then the question hits you in the gut. Can they actually make you sit there and wait for a drug dog? Before I explain this, I want you to answer something honestly in the comments. If an officer pulled you over for speeding and then said they were calling a K9 unit, would you assume you have to wait no matter how long it takes? Or would you think you're free to go? Drop your answer in the comments right now. I genuinely want to know what you believe. Because what most people think about K9 searches and roadside waiting is not what the law actually says. And there's a detail buried in Supreme Court precedent that changes everything. Let's slow this down. A traffic stop, legally speaking, is a temporary detention. That word matters. Detention means you are not free to leave. But temporary means the stop has a mission, and that mission is limited. When an officer pulls you over for speeding, the mission is addressing the speeding violation. That includes checking your license, registration, insurance, running warrants, and writing a citation or warning. It does not automatically include investigating unrelated crimes without justification. Now here's where things get interesting. Officers are trained to observe beyond the initial violation. They're watching your hands. They're listening to how you answer questions. They're scanning the interior of your vehicle. They're assessing nervousness, inconsistencies, odors, visible items, travel patterns. None of that is random. It's structured observation. But observation alone doesn't automatically give them unlimited time. There is a key principle that governs K9 waits during traffic stops. An officer cannot unreasonably extend a traffic stop beyond the time needed to handle the original reason for the stop, unless they develop independent, reasonable suspicion of another crime. That phrase, reasonable suspicion, is the hinge. It's lower than probable cause, but it's more than a vague feeling. It must be based on specific, articulable facts. Not just a hunch, not just "you looked nervous." Nervousness alone doesn't cut it. And here's something most drivers don't understand. Almost everyone looks nervous during a traffic stop. Now imagine this scenario. You're pulled over for a broken taillight. The officer checks your documents. Everything comes back clean. No warrants, no criminal history. License valid, insurance active, registration current. At that point, the original mission of the stop is nearly complete. Then the officer says, "Hang tight, I'm going to have a K9 unit swing by." Here's the critical question. Has the stop been extended beyond the time reasonably required to handle the traffic violation? If the answer is yes, and there is no independent reasonable suspicion, that extension can violate the Fourth Amendment. But here's where people get confused. Officers often multitask. They may call for a K9 unit while still processing your citation. If the dog arrives while the officer is still within the normal time frame of writing the ticket, courts have often allowed that. Timing is everything. You might think, well, if the dog gets there quickly, it's legal. Sometimes, but not always. Courts look at whether the officer deliberately slowed down the process to create time for the dog to arrive. That's a subtle but important distinction. Now let's talk about what officers are thinking. When an officer suspects drugs, they're not thinking casually. Drug trafficking's tied to larger enforcement priorities. Interdiction units are specifically trained for highway drug detection. If you're on an interstate corridor known for trafficking routes, your stop may be viewed through a different lens than a residential neighborhood stop. Travel patterns matter. Are you driving a rental car? Are you traveling late at night? Is your explanation of where you're coming from inconsistent with your vehicle contents? Are there multiple air fresheners? Masking odors? These are factors officers are trained to interpret. Now, do these factors automatically justify a K9 delay? Not by themselves, but layered together, they can form the basis of reasonable suspicion in the officer's report. And here's something people rarely consider. Everything you say during a traffic stop is part of the evidence puzzle. If you're asked, "Where are you headed?" and you respond vaguely, then your passenger gives a different destination. That inconsistency can contribute to suspicion. It may seem small to you. To an officer trained in interdiction, it's a data point. This is where behavior matters more than most drivers realize. Let's pivot slightly to another scenario, because this connects directly to driving with a suspended license. You're stopped. The officer runs your license. It comes back suspended. Now, the mission of the stop expands. Driving on a suspended license is not a minor equipment violation. It's often a misdemeanor offence. Now, the officer has lawful grounds to detain you longer because the situation requires additional processing. Potential arrest, vehicle impoundment, inventory search. And here's the critical overlap. If your license is suspended and your vehicle is being impounded, officers are allowed to conduct an inventory search of the vehicle. That search is not for drugs. It's to document property before towing. But if contraband is discovered during that lawful inventory search, it becomes admissible evidence. So the suspended license issue can indirectly create search exposure even without a K9 unit. This is why I say exit strategy matters. Not just legally, strategically. If you know your license may be suspended and you're driving anyway, you're increasing your risk profile during any stop. What might have been a warning for speeding can escalate into arrest, impoundment, and search. Now let's return to the waiting question. Can they make you wait? If the traffic stop's original mission is complete, and there is no reasonable suspicion, you generally cannot be forced to remain solely to wait for a drug dog. But here's the catch. You don't get to decide that roadside. You can ask calmly, "Am I free to leave?" That question is powerful. It forces clarity. If the officer says yes, you may leave. If they say no, you are being detained. At that point, the legal justification for detention becomes critical later in court, not roadside. Do not argue constitutional law on the shoulder of the highway. That is not where you win. Your goal roadside is documentation and composure. And here's something most people don't realize. Body camera footage cuts both ways. It protects officers, but it also protects you. If the stop was extended improperly, that footage becomes central evidence later. Now I want to touch on something uncomfortable. Some drivers consent to searches out of pressure. An officer asks, "Mind if I take a look?" The tone is casual. The environment is intimidating. Many people say yes because they believe refusal makes them look guilty. Refusal does not equal guilt. Consent waives your Fourth Amendment protection in that moment. Once you consent, the legal landscape changes dramatically. If you do not want your vehicle searched, you can say clearly and respectfully, "I do not consent to any searches." That statement does not guarantee the search won't happen. If the K9 alerts, that alert can establish probable cause. But without consent or probable cause, the officer's options narrow. Now let's talk about dog alerts, because this is where reality diverges from what people imagine. K9 units are trained to detect specific odors associated with narcotics. However, dog alerts have been challenged in courts. Defense attorneys often examine training records, certification standards, and field performance history. An alert is not magic. It is evidence subject to scrutiny. But roadside, an alert often means your vehicle will be searched. And if nothing is found, you may still feel shaken. Time lost. Dignity bruised. But legally, if the stop and sniff were conducted within constitutional limits, courts often uphold them. Now imagine this combined scenario. You're driving on a suspended license. You're stopped for speeding. The officer discovers the suspension. You become visibly anxious. Your answers about your travel plans are inconsistent because you're panicking. The officer calls for a K9 while processing the arrest paperwork. In that situation, the detention is already justified by the suspended license issue. The K9 arrival doesn't necessarily extend the stop unlawfully because the stop has expanded for legitimate reasons. This is why I say these topics are connected. Your driving status affects the entire trajectory of the encounter. And here's what I want you thinking about as we move deeper into this discussion. The law is not just about what officers can do. It's about what they can articulate afterward. Every extension of time must be justified on paper. Every search must be explained. Every detention must be defendable in court. Understanding that framework changes how you respond, there's something else coming that most drivers never anticipate during K9 encounters, especially near airports or major travel corridors. Civil asset forfeiture. Cash seizures. That's a conversation many people are not prepared for, and it can unfold even without criminal charges. But before we go there, pause for a second and think about your own driving history. Are you completely certain your license status is clear? Are you sure there are no old tickets, no missed notices, no administrative flags sitting quietly in a database? Because sometimes the biggest vulnerability in a roadside encounter isn't the dog. It's the assumption that everything in your background is clean,